Preparing to live stream the meeting.
Right, it's live, and I can see it on YouTube. It's working.
Woohoo! Well done,
Okay.
everybody.
Right.
Okay, stop your cameras.
Am I doing it? Yeah. Oh, I've lost the dog. Sorry about this. If you're watching, this is technical problems, which is the joy of Zoom. So, right, I'm just going to start. So, hello, everyone. Sorry for the delay in starting tonight. Welcome to Manchester Futurists. I have lost my notes, which is always great. Yeah, I'm Georgia. I'm your host for this evening, and this month we're joined by Edafe Onaheim, who will be discussing African and Afro futures. So thank you for joining us today. But before we start, we've got a bit of admin to address, and we have some rules in our code of conduct, which you can see on the screen right now. I think, hopefully, if everything's working to plan, which so far it hasn't tonight. Essentially, the main rule is please be nice to each other and give our moderators in the comments an easy job. So if you are wanting to ask a question, please write it in the comments, or you can write it on our social media, which is where you can also get in touch. So please do follow us on Twitter and Facebook for updates on our next event. And as some of you know, we're no longer on Meetup. So these are the platforms which we're using to get our activities across. And you can also catch up with the rest of our videos on this channel. And we realise that we don't have a sort of proper link at the moment, and that it might look quite random. But once we've got 500 subscribers, we can change it to our name. So that's a really good reason to hit the subscribe button now. So yeah, over to you, Edafe.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for sorting out all the technical teething problems. That's unfortunately something that we're all used to when you live stream. My name is Edafe Onaheim. I'm delighted to join you today to talk about African and Afro-futurism. Before I get started, a little bit about me. I'm a technologist. I work primarily in data, and my role is to help people get the most out of their data. It's around changing how people use data so that they can have it timely and they can have it in the form that they want to make decisions. And you might be thinking, well, how does that even have anything to do with Afrofuturism? Well, it means I'm very interested in human nature. I'm very interested in culture, and I'm very interested in how we design a better culture for data. And I'm also interested in that outside work. So one of the things that I read is fiction around African and Afrofuturism, but what on earth are those things? So I'll get started by introducing this movement. Think of it as a movement. So for many years, Black writers across the world have been writing about their experiences, have been centering fiction. Artists have been centering art, and philosophers have been centering philosophy around the future, the prediction of things to come, but rooted in their experience as Black people. And a few years ago, it was coined as Afro-futurism. And this is about Black cultures and Black experiences projected into the future. It's where those two things meet. It's where we look at things from a Black perspective and we put them in the future. And that can be a few things. It can be fiction. It can be speculative fiction. It can be hard science fiction. It can be fantasy. It can be talking about gods and wizards, but it can also be realism. It doesn't necessarily need to be science fiction or fantasy, even though those are my favorite genres. It can be about what is going to happen in the future. Now, why do we have two terms? Because I said African and Afrofuturism. Well, as with most things, when this was coined, it was specifically looking at the experience of African Americans. So it's very North American centric, very much about their experience with slavery, their experience with Jim Crow, and all the things that had come after that. So very much rooted in those experiences. And writers and creators and artists who came after that, who were all kind of lumped into this Afro-futurism movement, were not really comfortable with that categorization, mainly because this may surprise some people, but not if you're Black. Black cultures and Black experiences are not the same across the globe. I myself am an African immigrant. I was born in Nigeria. I now live in Glasgow, Scotland. My experiences are very different from someone born in Chicago, someone who grew up in New York. My experiences are going to be very different. And so a professor and author, Nendi Okorafor, coined the term African futurism. And that for her, it was about fiction, science fiction rooted in Africa. And for her, it was about bringing those African experiences and not being drowned out by the North American experience. And so you'll find those terms, but both of those terms cover what I like to think as a Black futurism. So introducing a nice new term for you there. So if you search for Afro-futurism, you'll find a lot more material, a lot more books, art, philosophy. It covers a wide range of areas because the future, it's about what's to come. So we needn't limit ourselves to fiction. We needn't limit ourselves to art or music. It can affect everything, architecture, philosophy, even new social political movements. So that is, in a nutshell, what Afro and African futurism are both about. And those are some of the areas that you will find these things happening. But I want to tell you a little bit about what it means to me personally, because it's fine to come in and talk about something really abstract and say, yeah, there's this great thing. But for me, it's actually been a journey. It's a philosophy of hope. So I'm not going to dive too deeply into definitions. I want to instead tell you about some wonderful work that you can read that is in this spirit, the spirit of this genre. So when I said about Afrofuturism, for example, you find books like this. This is New Sons. And this is a wonderful book written by people of color. And it covers not just Black people, but also other people of color. But the stories you're finding here are very much in the Afrofuturism area. In contrast, this is A Cat a Witch, which I love, and it's by one of my favorite authors, Nendi Okorafor, and this covers African futurism, or maybe in her terminology, Afro-Judaism, because it's fantasy set in Africa, and it covers things like being an albino woman in Africa, being someone a fish out of water, being in a place that doesn't necessarily accept you, your accent, or your skin color. Despite the fact that you're Black, if you have albinism, obviously you have a very clear indicator of being different. And it's about finding yourself in such an environment, a place that you should really be able to call home. So those are two books that I can recommend you could read if you're interested in either of these things, Afro-futurism or African futurism. They're the two things that you'll find very interesting. Now, my journey began in 2005. That's when I first became aware of this thing. I was reading a book by an English author who I'm sure most of you will know, Neil Gaiman. He wrote Anansi Boys, and I was reading it And I didn't think too much about it until I was maybe like third of the way through. And then I thought, oh my gosh, the character is Black. I thought, why is this such a shock? And I went back to the beginning to see if there had been any kind of thing to tell me that the character was Black. And that's when it struck me. In the genres that I prefer to read, so that's science fiction, fantasy, and speculative fiction, magical realism, in general, the authors do not describe the skin color of their white characters. And so whenever I read about a character, if their skin color was not described, I immediately assumed that the person was white. And this is what I've done in Anansi Boys. Now you might say, oh, well, it's Anansi Boys. Anansi is a character from West African mythology. He's a trickster god. How could you not tell? But I really did not even realize. And that's when I suppose I really recognized that there is a white by default, it's almost indoctrination that you don't realize, because you don't see people who look like you in the fiction that you're reading. I was kind of mortified by the fact that I had never thought about this. And of course, like any other realization, when you're thunderstruck, you think, where else is this happening? And I started to find other movements related to African and Afro-futurism. And where I work in the field of data, that is primarily decolonizing data, because we recognize as technologists that the future is going to involve a lot of artificial intelligence. And a lot of artificial intelligence products are built off data. And sometimes we'll say, we don't understand how this data is giving the artificial intelligence the idea that when you give it a picture of a kitchen, it should show a woman. But these things are built into the data that we have, whether those are images, whether that's text, numbers, whatever data you have, these things are built into it, these assumptions, these limitations. And if we want a future in Africa for Africans where they can thrive, the data needs to be decolonized so it does not include these harmful assumptions. And beyond that, so that it includes the things that are important to those people. We actually don't, despite the fact we collect a lot of data, we collect a lot of data that's dictated by certain groups of people. And so we may not be collecting the type of data that we really could help everyone. So for me, my professional life and Afro-futurism, African futurism intersect in decolonizing data. We often hear a saying that's attributed to the cyberpunk writer Bill Gibson, saying the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. Now, I used to think that was a geographical thing. I used to think, right, so this technology has just not reached this place or that place. I'll give you an example. When I was around 16 years old, I went to see my dad. I went to Jeddah, and I was amazed that they had these video screens for billboards. I had never seen this. I'd been to the States, and at that time, they didn't have this technology. So this was the only place I'd ever encountered this sort of technology. And it always kind of made me think, okay, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about the access to technology that is not available to everyone, but it is part of the future. And now we have video screens in the UK. Now that I think about it, having started to explore this journey, I think, well, whose vision of the future? Who is thinking about this future? And who's benefiting from it? Rather than thinking, where is this future taking place? So in a nutshell, as I began to explore Afrofuturism and African futurism, this led me through some themes through the movement that made me realize that the future that we see depicted in books, in films, in art, in music, is actually primarily dictated by Western civilizations, Eastern civilizations, and within those you might have African Americans, for example, or Black Canadians with their vision of the future, but we don't necessarily see Indigenous visions of the future. So I'm very interested in how we can encourage Indigenous artificial intelligence, for example, so that we can start to create a future that has many different attempts at these things like artificial intelligence, rather than it being centered in a very narrow range of experiences, that it flourishes by encouraging it to think about everything that is needed by Indigenous peoples, including African people. And that for me is part of the future that I see, that this movement can actually support. It helps us to think outside the box. It helps us to see that there are things beyond the very narrow, everyday tunnels that we travel through, that we can explore different things. We can have technology that supports and integrates with our spirituality, our beliefs, that supports our cultures, supports the people that we are, allowing us to be a fuller version of ourselves and removing the limitations that we found from both current and historical colonization of Africa as a continent. But what we always have to remember is that Africa is a huge place, and there is not one Black culture, there is not one Black experience. Although as a Black immigrant, I have more in common with a person from West Africa than I would have experience-wise than a person from Chicago. Still, I don't have as much in common with them today as I did when I was, say, 17 years old before I came to the UK. Nowadays, I probably have more in common with people who have immigrated to the UK and now living here. There is a set of experiences that you go through as you go through life, but always is that link back to your place where you were born, to the culture, to the people. And I'm going to end this by talking about one of my favorite books. This was one of the first African futurism books that I read. That was a clear departure from just thinking about a more Western influenced futuristic sort of vision of the future. So as I said before, Nnendi Okorafor, who has written this brilliant book, A Cat, a Witch, also wrote a book called Binti, and I'm just going to make sure that I've got the links here that I can share later, and they can show up for you if you want to go read them, because I know that it's sometimes difficult to find these just when someone's talking about them. And this book is about a person, a woman who lives very, very close to the earth. Her culture and technology are very tightly integrated. Everything from what she does when she wakes up, how she eats, the way she interacts with her family, despite this being thousands of years in the future, are all highly prescribed by her culture. And because they're so tightly integrated, she can't leave home. She wants to go off and explore the stars, but she can't, because how will she do that when she needs the very earth that she lives on? To clean herself, she uses the mud of her home where she lives to clean herself, to purify her hair. How is she going to live without all of these things? And it's about how she overcomes that. I don't want to spoil it because it's such an amazing book. I like to call it my entry point to African futurism, because it's such a beautiful story about, how do you overcome these challenges when your culture is so strong without losing who you are. And I love that the cover has a face of a woman with this rich red earth on her face. And I was so fascinated by this book, I started to look into the author. What I found is that Nnedi Okorafor is actually Igbo, and that's very close to where I'm from. I'm from Delta State, I'm a Robo. So she's Igbo, and I remember going to Benin City and seeing how red the soil is. Although this book is not actually inspired by Benin City, it's inspired by a very similar tribe. And that already brought back lots of memories. It brought back the sounds, the smells, the feelings of being in that city, the feelings of seeing their culture, seeing their art, which you can find in the British Museum, the masks, and just how integral this soil was to their culture. I think that all came flooding back reading this book. So it's one of my favorite books to recommend to people who are interested in African futurism, who really want to find out more. When it comes to music, another recommendation I'll make for you quickly when it comes to music is to check out Janelle Monáe. She has 3 concept albums out that cover quite science fiction areas. They're all about androids called Cindy Mayweather. And I find that very interesting as well, someone making music that centers on Blackness, but also centers on the future. And now this is more Afro-futurism than it is African futurism. One of the reasons that I really enjoy listening to music is that she's writing from the position of a queer woman. And again, that's another representation, another piece of representation that I feel as a queer woman myself, seeing this out there in the world. And I think it's very important to see yourself represented. It's important to see things like this highlighted, because I think that almost before I began to research this, I did feel there was something missing from my life. There was this root that was not really there, that I wanted to grasp. I lost myself in a lot of fiction. I lost myself in a lot of reading, but I couldn't really kind of quite grasp what it was. And as I started to read this, I realized that I had felt unrooted from my identity as an African. And that was what was missing for me. And these helped me to reintegrate that into my life. And that's why it's such an important and exciting for me movement. And for me, African and Afrofuturism means to be Black, gifted, and represented in an exciting area. And I know that we've had a bump in Afrofuturism. There's been the Black Panther movie in 2018 really got people interested. But I would love people to go beyond Wakanda, to go beyond that really exciting, enjoyable film and search out the Black African artists, movie makers, authors, and really kind of get to know Africa, either again, if you're from there, or start to learn about this beautiful continent that has so much to offer in a way that is less extractive, in a way that hopefully gives back to the people who live there and bring us these brilliant visions of the future that aren't just chrome corridors and, Hal telling you he can't do that. But, think of an AI that might actually support your ancestor worship. Wouldn't that be amazing? So with that, I will hand back to my wonderful hosts and let's get started with some questions.
Great, thanks for that. That was a really nice introduction to Afrofuturism and Afrofutures. So me and Ian, who is on the screen now, will be asking you some questions and just having a chat about it also. So those of you who are watching, again, if you've got questions, please feel free to ask. So I guess you mentioned it at the end there, but I think it's a good place to sort of start talking about it, because you mentioned Black Panther, and that, I guess, was the most that was the introduction for most people to the Afrofuturism. And I was wondering, do you think, so you mentioned sort of it did sort of help people's understanding of Afrofuturism, but do you think in some ways it also hindered how people perceive Black futures and Afrofuturism?
I think that it is, you have to remember what Black Panther is. I mean, now it is written by a lot of Black writers, but it didn't start like that. I mean, I love that Marvel have this history of supporting minoritized groups. I think that is amazing. But let's even take a look at some of the things that happens in the film. So everything, obviously it's a US film. So, right, when they finish the end of the film, the final scene, you see the prince you see the Black Panther go to America and start an outpost there. And I'm thinking, I love that juxtaposition of, oh, okay, so now we're helping the Americans because we've got more advanced technology, and there's a kind of yeah, that's great. But also, there's like lots of African countries that could probably do with your help. Why are you in America? But that's because all these films are centered and rooted in the US. They reflect the US Black experience, and that is perfectly fine. But they do take away, I think, from African writers who might be struggling to get work, or I should say African artists in general, not just writers, who might be struggling to get recognized and struggling to get work. So that's why I think that differentiation is actually useful.
So
yeah.
Go on.
Sorry, no, I was just going to ask then, I guess, so another film that came out around a very similar time was Get Out. And I wondered how, your thoughts on this is, so obviously me asking these questions, I'm very white, and I'm very much aware when I'm asking questions, maybe, am I asking the right thing? So if at any point I'm saying anything, and just say, no, it's wrong. But
we'll let you know.
Well, but that's it. It's, it's about trying to learn. And sometimes, I'm speaking as someone who, hasn't had these experiences, so sometimes I might not be saying things the right way. But say a film like Get Out, that was portraying a sort of a very different idea of what Black futures could be. And yes, it verged on sci-fi, but that came out at a very similar time to Black Panther. And they were sort of, I have a PhD in futurism. And when I was doing my PhD, there was a lot of comparisons between those two for thinking about, what is the Black experience like, and, ideas of colonialism things. So I wondered if your thoughts on, do those sit within sort of thinking about Afrofuturism and Afrofutures, because they're not necessarily this sort of utopian bit. Well, Get Out is definitely not a utopian vision, but, do those sort of come into this sort of topic of conversation as well?
Yeah, they will. I mean, I'm not trying to, by defining both Afrofuturism and African futurism, I'm trying to show that there's more than North America, rather than trying to say North America isn't relevant. The experiences, my cousin, for example, is American. Her dad is Nigerian, her mom's American, but her experience of growing up in Chicago is so different from mine, completely different, I do not share those experiences. So while I have the empathy for them and completely support the push for equity, I don't see myself in those films. And it tends to surprise people that I talk to, because I think, like I said, there's this conflation, right? There's this conflation that if you're Black, it's the same Black everywhere. But we know that's not even true for even any culture. I mean, if you're Irish, you're gonna have a very different experience from if you're English. We know this. But for some reason, I think it may be something to do with tokenism. We think, oh, if you've got a Black person, it's fine. And I find it interesting that the actor in that in Get Out is actually British. So we have a British actor who would have had a very, very different experience going to America to play an American character who would have had a very, very different experience. But the experiences are not interchangeable.
Yeah.
And it's the same, different again. If you grew up in Africa, you have a very different experience from somebody who grew up in the UK. You know, that's just unfortunately, I think, something that people don't tend to take into account. So Afrofuturism as a label can feel constraining to people who want to be recognized as being in Africa, and that can cause a little bit of friction there, but very valid experiences. And I would class those as you know, Afrofuturism, definitely not African futurism, but I would class them as Afrofuturism.
Yeah, because I think you know, my experience in a Caribbean family is also once again very different. Again, even from the American, maybe a little bit more closer, but not, which is also very different from Edafe's. You know, so it's really interesting the way I came at Afrofuturism. As I was known it, and I've thanks to Edafe, I now am using a better terminology for it. It's quite different from the way that she has, and you know, kind of conflate all that into one thing. It's always going to be problematic, and it's something that we need to be better at. We need to be better at, like, not kind of going, right, everything fits into this one niche thing. Everything fits into the Marvel kind of Black Panther experience. And obviously, you know, it's, I mean, personally, I think it's great that it was there. But you know, that was only one view on a much bigger space, much bigger.
I'm on mute. So you mentioned there as well, sort of different, you know, different sort of aspects of cultures, and I was wondering whether you feel that Afrofuturism is more welcoming to, say, queer cultures and people who are queer as opposed to sort of Western culture.
I wouldn't say that, no. This is it's a tricky one, because being queer is, you're already in a kind of a small subsection. I wouldn't say it's necessarily more welcoming. I think that you would find the same discrimination that you would find in mainstream cultures, right? So there isn't, I think, more welcoming. Certainly the community is, or communities are smaller, because when you find someone who writes about who you are, you're going to like try and buy every book that you can buy and talk about it with people who are interested. So it can feel more welcoming, but I don't necessarily feel that it is more welcoming. I think that there's still challenges in navigating Black cultures as there are in navigating mainstream cultures. And we have made a lot of progress over the years, but I think the challenges are still there for lots of different people.
Do you feel that, especially as the, you know, when it comes to Black futurism, that the people who are writing it are more likely to kind of be, you know, on the fringes as such, and so they write the things that really matter to them, rather than trying to fit it into the, you know, the kind of like the hero's journey type kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think you can get away with a lot more in science fiction and in anything that isn't rooted in today, because almost people are almost more forgiving of social structures that are different. They're more forgiving of seeing people who look different from them. Although you even find, like in science fiction, people go, "Oh no, you can't replace that character," and you think, "Character's green. Why can't you replace that character?" You know, like he assumed that they're white. They're literally green. So I don't think that. I think that queer people have always created wonderful work, and part of that is the struggle. you know, that kind of the friction has produced some wonderful work. Certainly, when you think about fashion, the fashion one is the one that's really interesting to me, is that you'll find that a lot of these trends are started by queer people, people on the fringes, as you said. And then they become popular, or they're using films. That's the other one that's always very strange for me, because the future in a lot of science fiction always seems to be a lot of PVC. And you know, it's like, that is a very strange, I don't really want to be wearing that, right? I don't want to be wearing that in the future. Where is the jeans? But these things are kind of then adopted and used in the mainstream. But the people who began the trends are not rewarded for the creativity. They're not necessarily uplifted. So it's nice to see big names like Beyonce including Indigenous artists in her like Lemonade. I don't know what you call it, concept album, concept video thing. It was really nice to see Indigenous people included in that, because otherwise it's more extraction, isn't it? And that's one thing that Africa has nearly always been synonymous with, is extraction, taking of things. And also that's something that the queer culture has always experienced, is that extraction. Something becomes, you know, the undercut becomes a great hairstyle, and suddenly everyone's got an undercut. Who's queer? You have no idea. Everyone's got an undercut. You know, it's all these things, all the edgy, interesting things, but they're then taken away from the producers. They don't benefit from it. And what I would like to see is Indigenous people and creators benefiting from things that they have created, from movements that they have started, and a kind of a reduction of this extractive process.
I was going to take it on a slightly different thing. So one of the things that when I first got into, I'll say Afro-futurism at the time, was this aesthetic that prides itself on DIY. So like you were saying about, there's all these people who are just going off and doing stuff for themselves, and they're making these spaces, they're doing things in a certain way. But it was kind of like, it was interesting because it was very decentralized, but also it kind of played on each other. So it was like, you're doing this, I'm going to take that and I'm going to do this with it, and I'm going to do that with it. And I was wondering if there was, if you felt that Western culture, I'm going to call it Western culture for now, we can talk about Eastern culture as well if you want to, can learn from this. Because it's obviously right now, if you do something, either it gets taken and extracted away from you, and then you get sued for doing the original thing, rather than like an attributional thing and like, oh yeah, we're definitely playing on that and we've put this extra thing to it. So I was wondering how you felt about that.
Well, as a technologist, I'm, you know, I know a lot about Creative Commons, but as a Black person who gets asked to do a lot of things outside of my actual paid job, I'm kind of on the fence with this. I think that yes, it's great to stand on the shoulder of giants, to build on other people's work, but you have to remember the exposure doesn't pay the bills either. So I'm one of those people that is kind of on the fence with this. My feeling is that most people are respectful when they're hobbyists of the boundaries of where do you stop? Where does it become you're just copying that person's work? And even if you attribute them, for me, that usually starts when money starts changing hands. And I feel like a lot of these practices, they say share your work so that others can benefit from it. And it feels nice, but we're not in a socio-economic system that supports that. Because if as an artist, you need to buy materials, at the very least, How do you keep yourself, how do you sustain yourself, right? That's a huge question. It's not like we've got, I don't know, universal basic income or anything like that. We're not in the Star Trek future where people don't need to work for money, they work for pride. We're not there. So I think that when someone creates something, we should think about whether or not how we want to use it is an extractive process.
But do you not think that so for what I was kind of led to believe, at least, that it was they also, there was a lot of thought about cooperatives, and that's the way that the future would be. So it isn't this kind of very strong capitalist system. They're like, you work as a community, you share as a community. That seemed to be some of the ethos in kind of the narratives that I saw out of Afro-futurism and African futurism.
I think that future would be lovely, and I call it the Star Trek future. I'm sure there are lots of other people who have imagined this type of future where it's not a capitalist society and you can essentially be your best self. And that would be wonderful. That would be a wonderful future. But game theory tells us that maybe that's not really something that is going to happen easily. It's going to be very difficult to get to that kind of future. It's not impossible. We certainly see collectivist societies that live in harmoniously, and we know that how we live now isn't sustainable. We know that we are or have maybe already passed the threshold for, say, for example, climate change and how that's going to affect the world. We know that we are finding the last few hundred years, in fact, the last 100 years, probably even maybe the last 50, we are finding the effects of our actions are being felt in places that they never have been felt before. So you're finding plastics in the ocean where they shouldn't be, really quite deep in the ocean where we shouldn't find these type of things. So we know that we are having an impact on our planet. This is the only one we have. I know lots of billionaires that want to go to Mars, but this is the one we have now, right? So we know that in future, something will shift or we'll end up in a dystopia. I don't know, but a collectivist society would be lovely. And a society where people are recognized for their contributions would be lovely. And I think that one of the great things about Afrofuturism and African futurism is exploring those things, maybe even taking trends from the past and bringing them into the future and helping people to think about how could we accomplish it, not just, it's not possible, it's impossible to do this. I like to give the example of the Indian, I don't think he was a farmer, and I really wish I had his name because I feel terrible not knowing his name. There's a story of a man who lived near a desert who reforested over 30 years, planted trees, and it's beautiful. And all I could think of was, I just hope someone doesn't go there with chainsaws and cut down all those trees because it's taken him 30 years to grow them. But what I do like is that people have actually been inspired by that to reforest other things, because you do have the desert encroaching in other areas. So reforestation has now become a thing, and then that's happening in Egypt, for example. So I was reading a wonderful paper about how they want to reforest some of the deserts in Egypt. And I think that those are good things. But, still difficult sometimes to see a way forward. But we know Black Swan events happen, things that you didn't expect to ever happen. 2020 has taught us that, if nothing else, that we can change, right? So a lot of the things that we say are just assumptions. They're not necessarily true. And there's a lot we can do together to change how things are. But again, this is a case of we need to be inspired to do so and to stay the path. Change is never really that easy, but it is possible.
We've got a question from someone watching on YouTube, which fits in quite well with that. And they ask, how much do you look to African futurism to set out practical ideas for society now, rather than just entertainment value? And I guess they're referring to sort of the popular culture aspects, like the music and films that we were talking about. Is giving a voice to less publicized perspectives powerful enough?
I don't think the voice is enough, but it's a start. So let's take an example. And again, I'll try and get some links if I can of all of these works, but they're fairly easy to Google. Octavia Butler is a great example of Afro-futurism. I'm sure Wrinkle in Time, people have watched that, if you've got kids or you've got Disney. So Octavia Butler has written lots of work about the future. And what someone else has done is taken her work and written about how that could be practically applied, right? So that's one way that people have been inspired to more practical changes based off fiction. We know that fiction is entertaining, but we also know that fiction can bring about real change. People can be inspired. For example, we know that Gene Roddenberry's pads in Star Trek inspired iPads. Flip phones, I know they're like old school now, but flip phones were also inspired by science fiction. So they can have an impact in real life as well. And then you have movements like the decolonization of data movement. Now that's another thing that I'd like to think is partly inspired by fiction, or at least by speculative futurism, going, if we project what's happening today all the way into the future, where are we going to start seeing problems? And that's something that I'm hoping has come from those type of movements. But also when I read science fiction and I think, that is actually quite terrible, that makes me think about practical things that I can do. And for me, my field, decolonizing data, is definitely one of those practical things. But we find our inspiration in lots of different places. My inspiration started in fiction. Maybe somebody else will be inspired by art. Someone else might be inspired by music, to think, oh, there's something different. There's something I can do differently. Or there's a different person. I can be different. I don't have to be this person. I can embrace being Black, and it doesn't take anything away from anyone else. It doesn't make anybody else lesser. It just makes me more of who I am. And that in itself is a change. A change in a person can also trigger that change in society and community. So there are practical examples out there, definitely. And people are writing about Afrofuturism, not just from a fiction point of view, but also from a practical socio-economic point of view as well.
I guess it's, that point about representation and the things you were talking about earlier in terms of artists and authors not suggesting race, and, it's not defining, but like attributing a certain race to a certain character and things. And do you think that's problematic for, I guess this is a sort of, I'm answering my own question, but how problematic do you think that is for young people growing up? And do you think that's changing now with sort of the younger, sort of more like fiction and music that's catered to a more younger audience?
I'm going to be, unfortunately, I don't really listen to music that caters to a younger audience, I can tell you. I'm going to assume so. But I do watch a lot of science fiction, and I do read a lot of science fiction. And yes, you do see more representation. It does matter. The first Black astronaut, that was amazing. It didn't make me want to be an astronaut, because I was like, yeah, there's no way I'm even going to pass the physical. But just knowing that was a possibility is the sort of thing that inspires people to change careers, to try new things. It's absolutely important to see people who look like you, sound like you, and experience the same things you do out in the world. And there's been an explosion of that recently, and we've had for me, for science fiction, so don't get me wrong, maybe it's not seen in other areas. So we had Falcon and the Winter Soldier, that was awesome. That was just, you know, I spent the whole 6-8 weeks just kind of yes at the screen all the time. It was just amazing. And obviously you've had lots of other kind of fictional stories come out in that time where you can see people who look like you. It's really helpful. I remember watching the original Star Trek and the comms officer, and I thought, well, that's not a great role, but at least she's there, you know. At least the comms officer is at least she's visible. I didn't think it was a great, I was like, no, I don't want to be there, I want to be the captain, but you know, yeah, she's there. That's good enough. And then having you know, newer series I can watch, and the main character is Black, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is good. This is really interesting. I mean, she's Black American, but still, it's like great. I can just, you know, I'm looking at her doing her hair every week, and I'm like, I understand that. You know, this is something I can relate to. So I think it's really important. And the thing is, I suppose, is that a lot of people don't understand why it's important. They think it's just tokenism. But you can tell it's very different when your lived experience is reflected on the screen. Because when it's tokenism, it's essentially a Black person written as a white person. You see no real difference, but you know, at least they look different. But when the experiences are different, I think that's when you start to feel really represented. And it's really important, because that's, you know, fires the imagination of things I could do. I could work here. I could be Captain America. I could do these things. You know, that's an amazing boost for young people.
Definitely, it's that thing of it just takes, you know, if it affects one person and makes them think differently, then it's worth it. And it, you know, if it changes the way they view themselves and their place in the world, then it's done its job. Like, yeah. So we've got time for one more question. Ian, do you have anything that's...
I have a question. I think it's gonna open up. It's probably going to turn into 10 minutes though, so I'll try and keep it. So actually, I'll ask the question. So I kind of, yeah, once again, I kind of came from like maybe the Afro-futurism kind of gateway, with Sun Ra and people like that. But the question I really wanted to ask was, do you feel that they're looking at Afrofuturism from like a architectural, environmental point of view? Do you think it has more to say about the environment than, I'll say, the Western culture right now?
I mean, that's something that is actually very close to my heart, because colonization has created a stark difference in how we approach the environment, right? African spirituality is very different from any imported colonized religions that are currently being practiced on the continent. In African societies, traditional African societies, everything, you know, works together. So you would no more harm your environment than you would harm yourself. But there's some nuance there. When we say Western, we're talking really about capitalists.
Yeah, sorry.
There's a huge nuance even in Western civilizations where there are some cultures that have that, you know, living with the environment as a forefront of their cultures, but in predominantly a lot of Western culture is extractive. It's short term. It looks at the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, you know, cut down all these trees. It doesn't think about how do we sustain it. It's not part of who you are. And I think that is problematic. When I grew up, I remember I was maybe about 12. I remember going to see my grandma, and she lived in Delta State, somewhere really, really remote. I remember driving through these maize fields surrounded the village. I remember how quiet it was, how there's just no pollution, you could see the stars. But I remember being fascinated by the hut that she lived in. I remember thinking to myself, why don't we build more huts? I mean, because obviously the reason we don't build more huts is because it doesn't fit into the colonized architecture. But they were brilliant. It'd be baking, and you would be in there, and you'd be cool, and the no air conditioning needed. I was just kind of fascinated by it. I think if I had ever gone into architecture, that would have been something I would have loved to look into. Why are we not using these traditional mud buildings, which we know are more sustainable? Today, we know they're more sustainable, but back then there was this kind of you need to build a concrete. And concrete is not even native to Africa. It's like, why would you come and manufacture this thing? It's so destructive to build houses. And I think that going back and finding those things is going to be really important. My concern is always about extraction. But, if it sometimes does feel like the culture that we're in, the predominant capitalist culture, is like a swarm of locusts. It comes in and raises a field. It does not replant. It doesn't think about how do we keep this field going. It's just about how do I get as much as I can today. And that isn't going to serve us in the long term. So going back to our spirituality and thinking about who we are as humans, not even as Black people, as humans, in a way that we can sustain ourselves, our kin, our neighbors, our communities, without destroying our home and destroying ourselves, I think would be a great mindset switch. And if that can start to impact our architecture and our environment, that could be amazing. That would be awesome. And, it'd be nice to not have this one thing is the right path mindset, because that takes away a lot of potential paths that we could travel, because we all like, well, this is the right way to do things, right? This is the only way to do things. And I think that is a huge misfortune for the human race. So if we can go back to our indigenous customs, start to pull things out of those that will help us survive the next few hundred years, we might not have a dystopian future, because I am tired of reading about dystopias.
No, definitely. That's a very evocative point to end on, I think. And thank you so much for talking to us today. It's been, I've definitely got a big reading list now. And if people want to find out more about the work that you do, or, follow you, do you have a Twitter account that people can follow?
I do. It's at Econa. So that's Echo Kilo Oscar November Echo Romeo. And unfortunately, I'm going to talk about data most of the time on that. But, come and yell at me about Afro-futurism, and I will share my bookmarks with you. And I will talk your ear off about things that I'm interested in reading. And if you've got something great for me to read, always happy. I've got this is just one of my bookshelves. I have lots more. My one vice is buying books. So do tell me about anything that you find interesting.
I know that people are asking in the chat for us all the links and stuff like that. We will, Hannah, who is an amazing writer, will be writing a blog post. So we will make sure that we list as many as we possibly can in there.
I will send you the links tomorrow morning, first things that you can add them. And there's lots of things in there to read. And I'll send you some of my bookmarks as well. And I'd love to know what people think about the books they read. So yeah, hit me up.
Great. Thanks so much again. And thank you for everyone at home for watching and joining us. The Manchester Futurists will be back next month with Melanie Wrightback, who will be discussing the future of entrepreneurship. Big words. So we'll see you again on July the 15th at 8 p.m. So thank you and have a good evening. So yeah, bye. Am I still live?